If you look at your life, every one of us has a list of priorities. Now, we rarely consciously think of what's more important than something else. But somewhere on that list there is your spouse, your kids, your family, your extended family, your career, your hobbies, your health. There's a whole hierarchy. And every day when you make decisions, without even thinking about it, you're assessing what's more important than something else. Maybe my comfort and my pleasure is more important than my health right now. Maybe my career is actually a little bit more important than my kids right now. All of us are making these decisions. One of the things I find fascinating as a priest is obviously working with a lot of our young adults and our young couples who are getting into relationships and preparing for marriage, is you start to see how when a relationship forms, all of these priorities start to get reshuffled. So say, for example, a young person meets somebody, and now this person who was a stranger kind of gets put in at maybe like number 20. They're less important than all their close friends, but they're now kind of part of the picture. And then maybe they start dating, and the person now goes up to like number 15 or something. That I'm prepared to spend a bit more time with you than I'm prepared to spend on exercise. And then the dating becomes a bit more serious, and now they're up to like number 5. That now they're spending more time talking to this person than they used to spend talking to their best friend. One thing I often find fascinating is you often see this crisis point in a relationship where the person realizes, I think this is becoming really serious. And I think this person wants to be number 1 in the priorities. And I'm not sure whether I want them to be number 1. Or I'm not sure whether I'm prepared to sacrifice the other things. I've spent all my time working on a career, and if this person becomes number 1, I might have to move to go live where they're going. And it's a real crisis point in a relationship, because you sort of realize that at this point you either have the person you love or you have the things that you love. You can't necessarily always have both. Now, I think that same dynamic is really at the core of our faith journey. Because this moment where God enters into the world, God becomes human, and he now reveals his love, and he says, I'm not interested in just being some far-off deity that you worship. I'm not interested in just being a God that you believe in. I want to be in a relationship with you. And actually, I want to be in such an intimate relationship that I'm at the very center of your whole life. The journey of discipleship is in a sense, the same journey of falling in love, where you start to understand who Jesus is, and you start to build a relationship with him, and you realize that he wants to go up the ladder of priorities. He doesn't want to be at number 20. He's not interested in sharing your time and energy with everything else. And there is this constant invitation. In a sense, this constant battle where I think the Lord wants to be at the very center of our life, but we keep saying there are other priorities. I'm happy to give you a bit of my time, but I've still got my other dreams, my other plans, and my other, all these things I've invested in. And I think the Lord loves us so much, he's like, well, okay, that's good, but I still want to be closer. Now, there is something of what Jesus is saying here in the gospel. He pulls the disciples aside. Now, they've been walking with him for quite some time now. They've started to realize who he is. They've realized that he's desiring relationship. But Jesus is pretty clear. He says, anyone who prefers father or mother to me is not worthy of me. Anyone who prefers son or daughter to me is not worthy of me. So he's saying, okay, wherever your parents and your kids are, I want to be higher than that. But then he goes on, he basically says, anyone who prefers their life to me is not worthy of me. I want to be higher than your very life. Your very existence. I want to be more important than that. That's a huge, bold claim. But kind of, we find ourselves in the same dilemma, that you can't really have both. You know, when Jesus says, anyone who finds his life will lose it, and anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, if you remember what Jesus says in John's Gospel, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Again, a very bold statement. He's saying, look, all of you are looking for life. And really the life you're living is really like a pale shadow of the reality. I'm the real thing. And so you've got to choose between the real thing or the imitation. You can't have both. You know, so if you try to preserve the imitation of life, there's no space for Christ to be at the center. Whereas if you are prepared to gamble everything and say, Lord, I believe that you are the life that I'm looking for, and I'm prepared to leave behind these other things, that's where we actually find the real deal. Now, I think that right there is the heart of Christianity. It's really difficult. You know, and this is, I think, why we come here every Sunday kind of reassessing, where is Christ in my list of priorities? How much have I experienced his love? Have I experienced a love great enough that I could actually leave behind the other things? Now, really, the starting point for our faith is that decision. You know, when a person is baptized, they make that decision to say, Lord, I want to leave behind all the other mess, all the other junk, and I want to put you at the center. Now, in the second reading, St. Paul describes this by explaining how baptism works. He basically says, when we are baptized, we kind of die to our old life. You know, in one of his other letters, he describes it almost like putting off clothing. You know, we take off the old life that we lived, and we put on this new life with Christ. And there was always this idea that baptism was this clear turning point. You know, one of the ancient authors described it almost like a running race where you run down and there's a turning point, then you come back. And at some point, we actually make this decisive decision to say, Lord, you're at the center. I think sometimes today in the culture of our church, we see baptism simply as being like an invitation to bring Jesus onto the list of priorities rather than make him number one. You know, I choose to be Catholic, I choose to kind of join the tribe, I'll be spiritual, but I won't be fanatical about it. You know, I think that's sort of the culture of our church in terms of baptism. But if you go back to the early church, it was a very different thing. You know, they would spend 3 years of preparation for baptism because they really believed this idea of, I want to leave everything behind and I want to make Christ the absolute center of everything. Now, in the early church, particularly at the times when Christianity was under persecution, this was more than just words. You know, when they would say, Christ, you are more important than life itself, they said that in the knowledge that they could very easily be killed the next day for believing in Jesus. You know, and in every church, people would have known people who would have been executed for being Christian. It was a living reality for them. There's something, I think, for us today where we need to rediscover this. to go beyond this idea of almost like a consumer Christianity, where Christ fills my need and then I draw a line. We need to come back to this idea of this real invitation to an intimate relationship where actually my life now revolves around him. We come here to the Eucharist where once again he presents this invitation. He says, I give my whole being, my body, blood, soul, and divinity to you. I hold nothing back. I'm inviting you to do the same, to reciprocate. So as we come, just to be aware of how again and again he calls us in his love and he invites us to reassess our priorities and to realize that he is the life that we're truly looking for.